Clara Voss had 52 acres of white salt crust, one spring that barely breathed, and a town full of people who had already decided what her future would be. She would last until the first hard wind, maybe until the first bill came due, certainly not until winter. The land was not called a farm, it was called the Salt Sink. That was how people said it in Box Elder Crossing in the summer of 1892, with a little bend in the mouth as if the name itself were a warning. Nothing rooted there, nothing grazed there. Rainwater slid into the flat bowl, turned sour and vanished under a skin of alkali. Men had lost horses in that mud. Children were told not to go near it. Even the county surveyor had written one blunt phrase in the margin of the plat, unfit for improvement. Clara paid $71 for it. She paid with 2 years of wages from a boarding house kitchen, the gold locket her grandmother had left her, and the last decent pair of gloves she owned, sold in a second-hand shop in Lincoln before she took the train west. When the freight wagon dropped her trunk at the edge of the rutted road, the driver did not climb down. He tipped the trunk off the back, watched it strike the dust, then looked over the land she had bought. "Lady," he said, "you paid money for a stain." Then he snapped the reins and left her there. Clara stood alone in the heat. Below her, the basin opened like a shallow wound in the prairie. 52 acres was not much, but from the road it looked endless because there was nothing on it that rose high enough to break the eye. No house, no barn, no fence worth naming. Just a leaning shelter made of poles, a line of low hills to the west, and the pale, sun-blasted hollow where water had come and gone for longer than any deed remembered. The ground around the rim was brittle and gray. The creek drawn on her purchase paper was not a creek at all, only a narrow, dark seam crawling through reeds that had died back to brown. The basin floor looked hard from a distance, but when she walked down the bank, her boots broke through a crust no thicker than biscuit skin. Underneath was black mud, cool mud, living mud. Clara crouched, pressed 2 fingers into it, and smelled what came up. Not rot, not only salt. There was clay in it, and old grass, and something wet that had been sealed under the white surface while everyone on the road looked past it. Then she saw the tracks. Tiny 3-toed prints first, the quick needle marks of shorebirds. Then wider marks, webbed and clean, running from the low reed bed to a shallow pocket where the mud was still soft. Teal. She knew that shape. Blue-winged teal, probably, from the size and the way the tracks crowded close, restless and feeding. The birds had been here that morning, not wandering, not lost, returning. Clara stayed there long enough for the heat to bite through the back of her dress. She followed the prints along the basin edge, saw where they overlapped, where old tracks had hardened and new tracks had pressed into them, where the bank had been polished smooth by small bodies climbing in and out. People had named the place a sink because they watched water disappear. The birds had named it something else, a stop, a feeding place, a memory written in mud. That evening, Clara walked half a mile north to introduce herself to the nearest neighbor, Milton Rowan, a widower with 2 sons, a tired house, and 160 acres that looked only slightly kinder than hers. Milton stood by his gate and listened without expression, while she told him her name and the land she had purchased. "The Salt Sink," he said. "Yes." "You planning to farm it?" No, that got his attention. His older son, Caleb, had been leaning against the barn rail with the hard boredom of 23-year-old men who believe the world has finished teaching them. He straightened a little. "What do you do with land you don't farm?" he asked. Clara looked back toward the hollow, though she could no longer see it in the dusk. "I hold water," she said. Milton stared at her. The younger son, Eli, almost laughed but thought better of it. "Water won't stay there," Caleb said. "That's the trouble. It stays long enough for Teal to remember it. There was a quiet after that. Not the quiet of understanding, the other kind. Milton rubbed a hand over his jaw. You bought 52 acres for ducks? I bought 52 acres because ducks are better surveyors than men who never leave the road. The boys looked at each other. Milton did not smile, but something near one corner of his face moved. From the house behind him, his sister Miriam Rowan stepped onto the porch. She was small, sharp-eyed, and older than Milton by enough years to have stopped caring whether men liked her opinions. "She eaten?" Miriam asked. Milton glanced back. "I didn't ask. I can hear that." Miriam looked at Clara. "Have you?" "Not since morning." "Then come in before the Prairie eats you first." At the Rowan table, over beans, johnny cake, and coffee gone bitter from sitting too long, they asked her the question everyone would ask for the next year. What exactly did she think she was building? Clara answered it plainly. A basin deep enough to keep the spring water from spreading thin. A clay lip at the south edge to stop the first rush of runoff from leaving. Willow screens to slow the wind across the surface. Reed beds to cool the margins. A narrow intake from the seep on the west hill, graded so low water could still move. Caleb listened as if each sentence proved she was getting worse. "You talk like an engineer," he said. "I worked 6 years in a boarding house where the roof leaked in 12 places. You learn water paths when you set the pans." Eli laughed once, softly. Milton asked the practical question. "What for?" Clara rested her hands around the coffee cup. "For birds first, eggs if they come, meat if there is enough, feathers if there is surplus, but mostly for what happens when the other shallow wells fail." Miriam's eyes stayed on Clara's face. "And you think they will?" "I think the grass is drying 2 weeks early. I think your windmill sounds tired. I think the creek on my deed has already given up pretending." "The dry year is not coming," Clara said. "It's here. People just haven't admitted it yet." No one at the table laughed after that. She slept her first month in the leaning pole shelter, with one blanket, one trunk, one shovel, one spade, and a fear so constant it became background weather. Fear of hunger, fear of being wrong, fear that the mud under the crust was only mud, and the birds had been a cruel accident. But fear did not tell her where to dig. The land did. Every morning before heat took the valley, Clara walked the basin. She marked the low places with stakes cut from scrub willow. She measured the slope with a borrowed level and a string pulled between 2 posts. She cut into the west bank and found a vein of blue clay, stiff and heavy enough to seal a wall if it was worked wet and tamped hard. She found the spring's true mouth under a mat of dead sedge, not where the surveyor had drawn it, but 9 yards higher and almost hidden by saltgrass. That changed everything. The spring had not died. It had been smothered. By the 2nd week, her palms were blistered open. By the 3rd, the blisters had torn, scabbed, and torn again. She wrapped her hands in strips of flour sack and kept digging. The plan looked simple when spoken aloud. Lower the center. Raise the lip. Bring the spring in slowly. Keep the wind off the skin of the water. Give the birds a reason to stay. In practice, it was a war against inches. One morning of digging moved what felt like a mountain and showed as barely a scar. Clay stuck to the shovel. Alkali dust burned her eyes. The sun came down without mercy. At noon, the hollow glared white enough to make her head ache, and she lay in the thin shade of the shelter, chewing dry bread and counting the money she did not have. On the 21st day, Miriam Rowan came across the prairie carrying a sack of meal and a jar of chokecherry preserves. Clara saw her from the basin and climbed out, embarrassed before the woman even spoke. "I can work for it," Clara said. "Mending, laundry, anything." Miriam set the sack down. "My mother was Pawnee. She used to say water never owes the person who finds it, it owes the thirsty. Clara did not know what to say. Miriam nodded toward the hollow. You find it first. We'll settle the rest after. That was the first gift. Caleb brought the second gift 4 days later, though he tried to make it look like an errand. He arrived with 2 horses, a drag scraper, and Eli riding beside him. Ma said you'd waste the summer hauling clay in buckets, Caleb said, as if Miriam were not his aunt, and as if he were only obeying a law of nature. Move aside. They moved more clay that morning than Clara had moved in 10 days. They did not talk much. The Rowan boys were not built for speech when work could serve the same purpose. Caleb drove the team. Eli handled the scraper. Clara wet each layer, packed it, and cut the lip into a curve instead of a straight wall, because water hitting a straight wall fought it. Water hitting a curve accepted it. At noon, they sat on the bank and ate what Miriam had sent. Eli looked down at the basin. It was no longer a stain, not yet a pond, but no longer only failure. A darker center had begun to show where the deepened bowl gathered what little water the spring released. If this works, Eli said, what do you call it? Clara considered that. Not a pond, she said. A refuge. Caleb snorted. For ducks. For whatever needs it. That answer stayed in the air longer than she expected. Word spread. It spread the way things did in Box Elder Crossing, changing shape with every mouth. By late August, Clara was no longer the woman who bought the salt sink. She was the spinster from back east digging a duck trap. Then she was the widow building a lake. Then she was the mad woman trying to raise fish in poison mud. Clara was not a widow, had no fish, and resented the word madwoman only because it was lazy. The most persistent voice belonged to Gideon Vale, who owned the grain scale, the supply store, 2 notes against nearby farms, and the habit of standing exactly where he could be overheard. He came out in the 5th week wearing boots too clean for the basin edge. I hear you intend to make water business out here, he said. Clara was kneeling in mud, shaping a feeder channel with both hands. She did not stand. I intend to make water stay, she said, and then I'll know more than I know now. Vale looked over the work. His eyes moved quickly, not with curiosity, but with arithmetic. Water belongs to a system, he said. A drainage, a community. It becomes complicated when one person alters a natural course. Clara pressed the inside curve of the channel smooth with her palm. Natural course was doing nothing useful. Still, Vale said, a person should be careful about creating expectations. Clara looked up then. A person should also be careful about waiting until something is useful before deciding it belongs to everybody. Vale's face cooled. He did not pick up a shovel. By September, the first teal landed. Clara was repairing a willow screen when she heard the sound she had been waiting for without admitting how badly she needed it. Not a splash exactly. A soft skipping strike across shallow water. Then another. Then the faint rustle of wings folding. She turned slowly. 3 blue-winged teal floated in the basin, small and perfect, their bodies riding the water she had fought into existence. One drake turned his head, showing the pale crescent on his face. The 2 hens nosed into the mud along the edge, feeding as if they had always known the place would be ready when they arrived. Clara did not move for several minutes. The birds did not flee. Something inside her loosened, not enough to become celebration, but enough to let her breathe. The land had answered, or maybe it had been answering all along, and she had finally done enough work to hear it. She began keeping a ledger that evening. Date, water level, bird count, wind direction, condition of clay lip, condition of spring mouth, reed survival, visitors, threats. Under bird count she wrote, 3 teal. Under remarks she wrote, they came back. October sharpened the weather. The basin held 9 inches at center, 5 along the eastern margin. The willow screens reduced the wind cut. Half the reeds she transplanted died, the other half rooted. The spring ran cleaner once Clara cleared the saltgrass from its mouth every 3 days. The teal count climbed to 11. Then 19. Then after a cold night that silvered the basin edge with frost, 32 birds came down in the morning light, teal and mallards together, circling twice before they landed. Clara stood on the rise with her coffee cooling in her hand and watched them settle. Caleb Rowan rode up behind her and said nothing for a while. Finally he said, "My father says this winter will be hard, because of feed, because of water." The north well dropped 6 feet since June. Clara looked at him. He did not like asking for anything. It made his shoulders stiff. "If yours holds," he said, "we may need access in spring. If yours fails, come before the cattle suffer. We can pay. You helped build the lip. That ain't payment." "It is to me." Caleb looked down at the birds, uneasy with gratitude in either direction. "You always talk like the argument's already over," he said. "No," Clara said. "I talk like I have work to finish." The first legal letter came in November. It was folded in cream paper and written by a man in Kearney who had never put a boot in the salt sink, but used the phrase historical drainage 3 times in 1 page. Gideon Vale had supported a claim from a farmer named Ansel Pruitt, who owned land east of Clara's basin, and now suggested that the natural movement of surface water might, under certain interpretations, connect to his acreage. Under certain interpretations. Clara sat on her shelter floor and read those words until they lost meaning. Then she pinned the letter to the wall and went outside to check the lip. There are threats that arrive with teeth. There are threats that arrive with stationery. Both can draw blood. She rode to Kearney the next week and spent $5 she could not spare for a legal opinion from a solicitor named Jonas Keene, recommended by Miriam through a cousin of a cousin. Keene was thin, impatient, and better than kind. He read her deed, the survey plat, the purchase receipt, and her description of the work. "Has Pruitt improved that drainage?" "No." "Has Vale?" "No." "Have you?" "Yes." "Then file your improvements before they file their complaint." The filing cost more. Clara paid it. It turned her private labor into public record. That mattered. Vale stopped making jokes after that. Winter came flat and brutal. The basin skimmed with ice at the edges. But the spring channel kept the center open. Clara broke ice morning and evening with a pole. Her hands cracked until they bled. Smoke from her little stove filled the shelter whenever the wind came from the wrong direction. She ate beans, cornmeal, rabbit when she caught it, and eggs traded by Miriam for notes Clara kept pretending were debts. The birds thinned but did not leave. 7 teal overwintered. 2 mallards stayed through January. On the worst mornings, they stood on the ice like indignant little judges, while Clara broke open their water. She wrote everything down. By February, the ledger had become 2 ledgers. By March, 3. The thaw came wrong. It came too fast, too early, and with almost no snowmelt behind it. The spring swelled for 6 days, then dropped back. The north well at the Rowans coughed sand. Pruitt's east draw dried by the first week of May. Box Elder Creek, which had once been a respectable ribbon through town, shrank into brown pockets connected by mud. The dry year had become a drought, and the drought did what droughts do. It made every opinion honest. Men who had laughed from the road began stopping without laughing. Women arrived with pails and tired eyes. Children came holding jars. Cattle bawled at dry troughs. Horses walked with their heads low. Every farm in the crossing became a set of calculations no one wanted to say aloud. On June 18th, Milton Rowan came to Clara's basin with his hat in both hands. That was how she knew it was serious. "Our well is gone," he said. "Not low, not bad, gone." "How many head?" Clara asked. 46 cattle, 9 horses, household. He swallowed, and Clara looked at the basin. The water stood 18 inches at center, 14 along the cattle access bank she had built because some part of her had known this day would come. The teal lifted from the south margin, circled once, and settled again. Bring them in groups, she said, not all at once. 15 cattle at dawn, 15 before noon, the rest at dusk. Horses separate. Miriam can draw from the spring channel, not the basin. Milton's face changed. It tried not to. I was wrong about you, he said. You were wrong about the land. He nodded once, accepting the correction. That too. By the end of June, 6 families were using the basin. By July 10th, 9. Clara built a schedule with a slate board nailed to a post. Household water at midday. Livestock at dawn and dusk. No washing at the basin. No animals on the north reed bed. No taking more than the allotment. If a family had food to trade, tools to lend, soap to make, meat to smoke, mending to do, seed to spare, it went into the common ledger. Not charity. Not commerce. Survival accounting. Miriam managed the ledger better than Clara could have. Caleb enforced the cattle times with a bluntness that saved everyone trouble. Eli repaired the willow screens. A girl named Ruth Pruitt, Ansel's niece, counted birds with such deadly seriousness that Clara handed her a pencil and let her take over the morning count. The basin became the center of the valley. Not because Clara had wanted authority, but because water creates authority, whether anyone wants it or not. That was what Gideon Vale understood. He came on a copper-colored afternoon in July with Ansel Pruitt and a lawyer Clara had never seen. Dust rode the wind. The water line had dropped 2 inches in 9 days. Clara had slept badly enough that every sound felt sharp. Vale stopped at the post where the schedule hung. 9 families, he said. That is no longer a private arrangement. Clara stood between him and the bank. It is private land voluntarily shared. The lawyer opened his satchel. Vale raised one hand, graceful as a man stopping music. No one wants conflict, Miss Voss. But a water source serving public need should be overseen by public-minded men. Miriam, standing behind Clara with the ledger against her hip, made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any amusement. Public-minded men, Clara said. Where were they when this was poison mud? Vale's mouth tightened. The drought changes circumstances. No, Clara said. The drought reveals them. She pointed toward the basin. When it was white crust, it was mine. When it was labor, it was mine. When it was broken hands and frozen mornings, it was mine. Now that children are drinking from it, you arrive with a satchel and call it public. The lawyer looked at Vale. Ansel Pruitt looked away. Vale did not. You are carrying liability you cannot manage, he said. Bank failure, contamination, dispute. You could lose everything. I already spent everything to build it. That is not the same. No, Clara said. It is harder to frighten a person who has practiced losing. The dust moved between them. At the water, Ruth Pruitt called out, not knowing or not caring that men were trying to threaten the world into shape. 28 birds. Clara looked at Ansel. Your niece trusts this mud enough to count what lives on it. That landed harder than the legal talk. Ansel shifted in his saddle. Vale saw it. Clara saw Vale see it. The lawyer closed the satchel without opening it fully. This discussion will continue, Val said. I'm sure it will, Clara answered. Not at the bank, not today. They left. Only when they were past the rise did Clara notice her hands shaking. Miriam noticed too and said nothing, which was one of her finer kindnesses. The worst week began August 3rd. The spring dropped to a thread. The sky went white. Dust covered the basin each afternoon in a fine powder Clara hated because she could not stop it. The water reached 12 inches at center, then 11 and a half. The reeds along the north bank curled at the tips. The cattle access had to be cut by 20%. Household allotments fell by 1 quart per person. Nobody argued. That frightened Clara more than argument would have. Argument meant people still believed there was room to bargain. Silence meant they had seen the bottom of the numbers and knew she was not being cruel. On August 7th, little Ben Sutter fainted while carrying a bucket back to his mother's wagon. He was 6, too thin, too proud to say he was hungry. Clara carried him to the shade, and Miriam brought water sweetened with the last of her molasses. Ben came around embarrassed and angry, which Clara considered a good sign. That evening, Clara walked the nests. She had protected the birds from the beginning. The refuge had never been only a storage tank. The teal were the proof that the basin was alive, not merely wet. But she also knew which nests had failed. She knew which eggs had been abandoned, which clutches were too old, which shells showed no development when held to lamplight. She collected only those 37 eggs. She distributed them at dawn without speech-making. The Sutters got 6. The Rowans got 4 and tried to refuse until Clara glared at Caleb. The Pruitts got 5, though Ansel sent Ruth to receive them because he could not bring himself to meet Clara's eyes. Ruth held the small crate with both hands. "My uncle says your pond saved the east side. What do you say?" The girl looked back at the basin, where the teal moved through shallow light. "I say they knew before we did." Clara smiled for the first time in days. "Yes," she said, "that's close enough." By August 10th, the center stood at 10 inches. Critical was 9. She knew that because she had written to Elias Martin at the State Agricultural Station, a patient man who had answered every letter she sent about clay sealing, plant survival, bird capacity, and water loss. His last letter had included calculations in neat columns, and a sentence that kept repeating in her head. Below 9 inches, ecological stress will compound faster than human management can correct. Faster than human management can correct. That was the kind of sentence that sounded calm, because the man who wrote it was not watching children drink from the margin. On August 11th, Clara stopped accepting new livestock access. It was the hardest rule she had made. A family from 12 miles south arrived with 5 horses and 2 cows. Clara gave them household water and refused the animals. The woman cried. Her husband cursed once, not at Clara exactly, but at the sky, at his luck, at the fact that fairness could still be merciless. Caleb stood beside Clara through the whole thing. After they left, he said, "I can do that part next time." "No, you shouldn't have to." "That's why I have to." He looked at her, and for once had no answer. That night, Clara did not sleep. She sat outside the shelter watching the basin under a moon so bright it made the salt crust shine like bone. The birds were quiet. The valley was quiet. Drought had stripped sound from the world one layer at a time until even insects seemed to be saving themselves. She thought of the freight driver calling her land a stain. She thought of the county words, unfit for improvement. She thought of every person who had stood at the road and seen only waste, because waste was easier to believe than work. Near dawn, the wind changed. Not much at first, a cooler edge against her face. Then the smell, wet dust far away. Clara stood. To the west, behind the low hills, the sky was bruising purple. She walked to the measuring stake. 10 inches, barely. The basin held the last narrow margin between managed scarcity and failure. The first drop hit the back of her hand at 6 in the morning. Then another struck the dust by her boot, making a dark coin on the ground. Then the rain came. Not a storm that tore things apart. Not a flood that punished the work. A steady, hard, cold rain that seemed to enter the earth instead of running from it. It rang on the willow screens. It dimpled the basin surface. It darkened the banks until the whole hollow changed color before her eyes. Clara stood in it, She could have gone inside. She did not. The water climbed the stake so slowly that anyone else might have missed it. A quarter inch, then half, then 1 full inch by noon. The spring, which had been no more than a thread, began to run clear from the west bank. By evening, the basin had risen to 13 inches. By the next morning, 16. On the third day, 21. The valley did not cheer. Real relief is often too tired for cheering. It exhaled. Milton Rowan came on the second afternoon of rain with his sons and Miriam in the wagon. He stood at the bank, hatless, rain running down the lines of his face. "My herd drinks because you read bird tracks," he said. Clara looked at the water. "My herd drinks because you lent your boys and your team. I lent tools to a woman I thought was bound to fail. You lent them anyway." Milton nodded, accepting that as the only mercy he would get. Then he turned to his sons. "Ask her what needs doing." Caleb looked almost offended by the order, though he had been waiting for it. Clara pointed toward the south overflow cut. "Clear that before the rain gets heavier. If the lip overtops wrong, we lose half the bank." Milton picked up a shovel. That was the first time Clara saw him work on the basin. It was not the last. After the rain, Box Elder Crossing changed slowly, not into gratitude. Gratitude is too simple a word for a town that has been wrong in public. It changed into use. The Rowans kept a scheduled water right and paid in labor. The Sutters built a smokehouse arrangement, preserving meat for families who had nothing left to waste. Miriam and 2 other women made soap in batches and kept the wash water away from the basin. Ruth Pruitt became the official bird counter because everyone trusted her numbers, and because Ansel Pruitt, shamed by both Drought and his own niece, stopped lending his name to Gideon Vale's complaints. Elias Marden came from the agricultural station in October. He was younger than Clara expected, with spectacles that fogged in cold weather and a notebook that looked too clean to be trusted. But he walked the basin properly. He asked where the clay held. He wanted to see the spring mouth. He crouched at the waterline and touched the mud before he made any conclusions. That earned him Clara's respect. "You made a constructed refuge out of an alkali sink," he said after 3 hours of looking. "I made water stay." "Yes," he said. "That is the plain version." He looked at the teal moving through the reeds, then at the schedule board, then at the ledger Miriam had kept through the drought. "You should write this for publication." Clara almost laughed. "I write measurements." "Then write measurements. We will call it a bulletin if that makes it less frightening." Who would read it? Anyone with a useless wet hollow. Anyone being told a low basin is worthless. Anyone with birds landing where men say water will not hold. Clara looked across the refuge. The basin was not beautiful, in the way paintings taught people to recognize beauty. It was muddy, reed-choked, practical, scarred by work. The clay lip showed every tamped layer. The willow screens leaned. The measuring stake was stained at every crisis line. But 46 teal lifted from the water as one body and circled the basin before settling back down. It was alive. "I'll write it," Clara said. The bulletin came out the next spring under a title so dry even Miriam mocked it. Alkali Basin Improvement for Waterfowl Refuge and Drought Reserve Use. It was 38 pages. Too many measurements, according to Caleb. Not enough, according to Ruth. Clara's name stood on the cover with Elias Marden's, and the first section began not with a theory, but with a sentence Clara insisted on keeping. "Look first for where the birds have already trusted the ground." Letters arrived from Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, and Dakota. Farmers, widows, ranch hands. One schoolteacher with a flooded schoolyard. Men who did not say they were desperate but asked desperate questions about clay ratios and seep recovery, and how to tell poisoned crust from sealed moisture. Clara answered them all. Gideon Vale returned once, months later, alone. He stood at the road above the basin while Clara repaired a section of spring channel. He looked smaller, without witnesses. "I misjudged the enterprise," he said. "You misjudged the ownership." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I have capital. I know. The North Hollow above your spring could be developed as a second reserve. I know that too. I would invest." Clara wiped clay from her hands. Vale waited, uncomfortable, because he was not used to standing in silence created by someone else. "Same rule as everyone," Clara said. "Money buys written return. It does not buy command. Families who survived on this basin keep access in dry years before any investor heard. The birds keep the north bank. The ledger stays open." Vale looked at the water. A year before he would have argued. Now the basin behind her had made argument expensive. "Have Keene draw the papers," he said. Clara nodded. After he rode away, Miriam came down the bank carrying the afternoon count. "You trust him?" "No." "Then why take the money?" Clara looked toward the North Hollow, where the spring seep darkened the hillside, even in dry wind. "Because not trusting a man is not the same as refusing to use him carefully." Miriam laughed at that, a real laugh, and handed over the count. 51 birds. Clara wrote it in the ledger. That autumn, the second reserve began as the first had begun, with a shovel, a line of stakes, a cold seep, and people watching from the road. But they watched differently now. Some still doubted. That was fine. Doubt had never bothered Clara much. Doubt was a weather condition. It could slow work, but it did not decide it. The ground decided. The water decided. The birds, in their small ancient wisdom, had decided before any of them. On a clear morning in October, Clara stood at the edge of the original basin and looked down into the refuge. The water held at 20 inches. The inlet ran clean. The clay lip was solid. Reeds moved in the wind. Teal threaded the margins like living punctuation marks. In a sentence the Prairie had been trying to write for years. She thought of the day she arrived with one trunk in the dust and a driver laughing at what she had bought. She thought of the white crust, the black mud underneath, the first webbed prints pressed deep into the bank. People had called the place empty, because emptiness excused them from looking closer. They had called it waste because waste asked nothing from them. But under the crust, the land had been keeping its evidence. Clara picked up the mattock and walked toward the north seep, where the next basin waited. The Prairie had never been empty. People had only stopped looking under the crust.